Adam Dayem. I am an architect based in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm also a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York.
We are discussing your Sleeve House, which is a speculative project that you initiated and built in upstate New York. It is your first built work, which started as a house and eventually grew to more commissions, a guest house with a pool and a winery, although only the house and the pool remain to be built. So let's
Mhm.
start with the origins of this project. What was the driving force, not only for its design, but also for starting it because it was your initiative. You didn't have a client. So if you could talk about that.
There was a story I had in mind about who the client would be. I live in Brooklyn and I teach in upstate New York. I am always back and forth in between those two places, and there are just a lot of really beautiful landscapes in between here and there. And I was interested in finding a site in between Brooklyn and Troy, New York, to do a development. More specifically, the impetus for the design came out of a couple of things that were interesting to me and that I was working on in my teaching and my design studios and teaching at that time. One of them was just simply volumes within volumes. I was having my students create digital models that nested one volume within another volume as a way of starting to think about space. And I liked that in terms of the students' projects development because they weren't always completely in control or couldn't anticipate exactly what would happen when they nested two things together. And I saw it as a really productive way to start to think about spaces at different scales. The other thing in my design studios was an interest in developing surfaces with texture on them. And then the third thing, which I doesn't really come out of teaching, but it's just been a fascination of mine. Ever since I could remember being interested in architecture, is objects in the landscape. And there's just something I think that's very powerful about an object that you can recognize as being designed, but sitting out in a landscape, and you get a view of it from a distance. I can't necessarily articulate why that's always been powerful to me because it's something that I felt even before I began to study architecture. But that was something that I recognize, or I really see in these kind of agricultural buildings in upstate New York. There are barns and silos out in these fields that I'm really drawn to as these objects in the landscape.
So, speaking about the landscape, if you could talk about the site, how you found it, and how did you envision it?
It took a lot of looking. The site is 2 hours north of New York City, and within that radius of New York City, things are it's difficult to find something that hasn't already been taken or something that doesn't cost a lot of money because it's of the proximity to New York City. And I spent a lot of time looking at land that would be able to kind of convey this sense of the object in the landscape. And so much of land in upstate New York is just forest, so you don't get that sense. And I happened upon the site um, just online and went to look at it, and immediately I felt like it was the right spot. And the I think the reason that I was able to like it was affordable within the project budget that I had set out was that it was a plot of land that was divided into three sections. There's a road that goes through it. dividing one part from the other, and then the larger part is also split by a tree line. And so it wasn't a desirable plot for somebody who wanted to just build one house, which I think that's probably what most people wanted to do. And so I could immediately see three building sites there. And I think because it was a little bit unusual for most people, it was more affordable. So I got the site that was open and had views of the surrounding mountains, but it was also happened to be kind of quirky enough to also be affordable for the project budget that I had. Initial idea was that I would build three houses and sell all of them. And I the sleeve house is built on kind of this open site, maybe not what I saw as like the most desirable site, because I was sort of saw it as maybe a bit of a warm up project or a practice. And so it has views of the surrounding mountains, and I think it's a really beautiful site, but it doesn't have quite the most dramatic views out of all of the sites. So my idea was to build a sleeve house first, and then there was another project that I developed that in a similar sort of theme for the most desirable part of the site. And then my plan was that possibly on the third site, which was the most forested and maybe the most kind of hidden site, it was like less about the object in the landscape, but more about uh, a building kind of in the woods. The plan was maybe I would build something there, and the idea is that okay, well maybe make some money on these two houses, and then have enough to like keep the third one. Um, Obviously, the plan didn't play out in that way at all, but that was the initial idea going in.
So let's talk about the sleeve house, the first house that you did. You already mentioned three guiding forces. So the first one was an object within an object. The second one was the attention to surface, and then landscape, an object on a landscape. So how did you merge these three ideas into this project?
Well, for the object within an object, that was interesting to me because it was a way of thinking about how you could distinguish different kinds of domestic spaces. Some spaces in a house could be larger scale and have maybe less residential feeling materials, but then other, like the living room, entry area, dining room, things like that. And then other spaces in the house could have a more intimate scale and like softer materials. So that really lent itself to this idea of like an object within an object. The spaces in between the inner volume and the outer volume, that's where you enter into the house. That's the living room, kitchen, dining room areas, and they have high ceilings and they have harder finish materials like concrete and wood siding that comes in from the outside. So there's this continuation of material that goes from the outside to the inside. And then on the second level, the inner volume is hovering within the space, and you go up a stair that is in between the inner and the outer volume. So there's this idea of like creating space in the in between, and you travel through that space to get into the inner volume. And in there, the spaces are smaller scale. Like a bedroom and a study, and they're finished with softer materials and more like typically domestic. So, like the living room, dining room area. Really, my idea was that the house was designed for art collectors who lived in the city. Like that was the story that I had in my mind. So those spaces are conceived a bit more like an art gallery space. Concrete floors, high ceilings, and trying to avoid it like feeling like a domestic space.
Could you talk about some of the elements of the house that you already mentioned, but maybe if you could elaborate the relationship to the landscape. I wonder if there were any references. You mentioned such forms as barns and silos. So if you could talk about maybe those and your design process.
Yeah, well, this idea of barns and silos as these objects in the landscape, um, they're really like simple, pretty pure volumes. They don't look like residential buildings. They don't, or any other kind of building typology. They don't have a lot of windows. So, and they're like these just simple volumes, not a collection of things, but it's just like one volume. And they are generally quite weathered. So they have this kind of quality to the skin, like even some of these buildings that are abandoned, are just weathered to the extent that you can like see through the wall, like the wall, like the skin is so warped and it's so like roughened. And I was really, drawn to that kind of idea, like the, simple volume doesn't look like a house, but then also has this very kind of textured skin. So with the sleeve house, the idea is to keep the overall volume pretty simple. There's what I see as a relationship to the slope that it's sitting on. Uh, there's a sectional relationship where the house steps down the slope, but also the house kind of leans in relationship to the slope. So there's a kind of, it doesn't just like sit straight up and down, right? There's some kind of response in the form of the house to the terrain that it sits on. Which I mean, that's not like a barn or a silo, right? It's like a more of a contemporary architectural move as opposed to just being like purely inspired by these agricultural buildings. And then the skin of the house there was a lot of development there to try to recreate some of the sense of the simple volume of the barns and the silos, but has like a high degree of texture. So the skin is this burned wood. It's a traditional Japanese technique of burning wood to basically preserve it. Like, but once you burn the wood, it's highly resistant to weather and rot. So that's obviously a benefit when you're designing a wood siding project. But then obviously it has this beautiful black texture to it, which I was drawn to that. So the siding is a two-layer system. The first layer sits flat on the house, like normal siding, and then the second layer sits on end. So the boards are actually projecting out away from the house, and the spacing changes and the dimensions of that change. And that outer layer also wraps around the corners. And so that gives it this kind of textured look. I mean, that was the idea that obviously you can't have like an old barn or silo in the house. You can't let the weather in, right? But this two-layer system was a way of kind of creating that sort of texture while still obviously creating a tight envelope. And the other thing that I was able to do with that two-layer system is then let the outer layer go over the windows on the side of the house. And that was mainly the idea was that, well, then the windows don't appear as they're not so prominent on the facade. And even from some angles, the window disappears. And for me, that was a way of making it look less residential and a little bit more like a barn or a silo that doesn't have any windows on it. And to me, that was like making those windows disappear was a way of making it more of this kind of simple object, right? That doesn't sort of belies its kind of nature as a residential building.
What about a number of schemes. Did you go through different ideas, or it developed in a way in a certain direction that you set from the beginning, or did you have any sudden and unexpected changes?
Well, I think there was a pretty clear direction going in because of this idea of the volume within the volume. And there were a lot of iterations of, well, how to fit the program into this. I mean, that's the main thing. Was okay. Well, if we have one rectilinear volume inside another one, and I thought the fact that it was kind of elongated helped it relate to the slope. Um, but then it was mostly a matter of how to create like this space in between the inner and outer volume. Like, what programs would those hold? How big would it need to be? Where is the circulation?
I wonder if you have had any surprises that you discovered while working on this project, either in the design stage or when it was already being constructed. And would you say this house can be considered your manifesto that really made an effect on your subsequent projects?
Given that it was my first project, there were, I think, many surprises and discoveries along the way. Um, I think one is just a belief in representation that wasn't quite uh, fully realized in my mind. That if you draw something, it's actually going to look like the way that you drew it. And if you have a drawing that looks the way you want it to look, if you have a floor plan that looks right, then it probably is right, correct, I think the other thing is just where you're willing to compromise your idea for constructability. And I suppose this is probably something that every architect learns on their first project, is how much are you willing to compromise for the sake of budget or constructability or time frame. I worked with an amazing contractor on this project who was essentially willing to do anything. I mean, he never looked at something and said, okay, we can't do that. But it's just a matter of like, well, how long is it going to take me, and how much labor is involved, and how much time do you really want me to be spending on this? And so a lot of moments in the design had to be simplified in terms of constructability. As far as whether it's the project is my manifesto or not, I think that maybe at that point it was in a way my manifesto. But since then, I mean, we're always evolving, and so I think now I would. If I was asked to do something similar, it would be, there are definitely themes that I would pick up on there, but there would also be, I've changed and I've evolved since then also.
What happened, if you could talk about it, once the building was completed? I understand that it took a while to find the buyer, but eventually, when you did sell the house, I understand that the buyer became a client for other projects. If you could talk
Mhm.
about those additions.
When the right buyer came, it was great because they appreciated the ideas behind the architecture, and they really enjoyed it as a house. And so they asked me to design more buildings on the site. And so that was, I think, the best case scenario for me is to, not only get something built, but also like create a relationship with somebody who really appreciated that architecture. So they bought all of the land. I was happy to sell all of the land to the buyer because I didn't really have a desire to like do these other projects that I initially thought I would want to do. So the buyers were they wanted they wanted a winery, and so a vineyard, planting vineyards. They saw it as the terrain, the topography of the site happened to lend itself to planting vineyards. It had the right exposure, it had the right drainage, and so they bought the property and pretty immediately started planting vineyards on the site and asked me to design a guest house and a pool. And I had always had plans and an idea in mind for where the pool would go. There's an access out, kind of a sort of back door in the house that I imagine being a route to a pool. And they wanted the pool and the guest house. Initially, they wanted those projects first. We did the pool, so that's built. But after the pool got started, they decided they'd rather develop the winery building first.
I want to ask you more about, I guess, the geometry of the house. So it appears formally very controlled, yet the lived experience of the project feels surprisingly ambiguous and unstable. So I wonder if this tension is something that you consciously pushed for, and how important it is for you to achieve this kind of perceptual instability in your work.
Yeah, I think that I'm in, definitely interested in the oblique and the kind of instability that produces, and sometimes ambiguity. So you're right that there are the geometry of the house and the winery are in many ways they are very controlled and very regular. A rectangular footprint with one angle introduced. I think the house, you could say that there's one angle introduced in plan, and there's one angle. Well, I mean, maybe I'd say it this way. There's one angle introduced in the XY coordinate, one angle introduced in the XZ coordinate, and another angle introduced in the ZY coordinate. Like they're like they're three spatial dimensions, and there's just one angle introduced in each one of those, and that I think it produces well the relationship between the building and the landscape. There's a kind of a dynamism between the two. It looks like that maybe the house is sort of sliding down the landscape rather than it appearing completely static. The the angle in the plan, I think, creates a sense of like the opening up and closing of space, which I enjoy. It's a play with perspective perception. If you're highlighting, kind of emphasizing the vanishing point in one direction, then that gives you this compression of space perceptually, and if you open it up in the other direction, it gives you this expansion of space. And so the and if you look at it in plan, the angle that's introduced is designed to give you this like extension out into the landscape and draw the eye out into the landscape. So yeah, I mean it's an interesting observation. I never exactly thought about it like that before, but I think it is something to sort of like control, but like with a few moves, you just like introduce this dynamism or instability.
And I wonder if the angle in all three cases along each of the direction, is it the same angle? And was it introduced by you? Was it set, um, from the very beginning, or did you adjust it while you were designing it because you were considering how the family would live in it, or was it something that you approached in a more abstract way?
More in an abstract way. They're all multiples of three. Um, I don't know. I mean, don't, I'd have to go back and check because it's been a while since I designed it, but I believe the angle and plan is three is 6 degrees. The angle of the roof is like 3 degrees tilted up, and the angle that it leans out is 9 degrees,
Oh.
I believe. So there was, I suppose, um, just trying to feel out like what would create this sensibility that I was after through the representations. And I suppose this goes back to like this discovery of like the power of representation for me was like, okay, well, if I make the drawing look like this and the drawing looks the way that I want it to do, like will like the building do what I imagine it to do? And to a large extent it did, and that was interesting. But it's also kind of abstract. There was just a kind of a game. It's like, well, just limit it to increments of three and like choose one of these angles, which are increments of three.
Your projects often rely on nested systems, such as a box within a box, and there is another house that you did, which is a void within a mass,
Mhm.
surface within surface. What attracts you to architectures of containment and enclosure?
Well, I think for me, it's a way of questioning conventions. Um, and I wouldn't say like I'm incredibly ideological person, and that kind of moves over into my architecture as well. I'm a lot more interested in um, working in a way that opens up new avenues of development. I don't think that I necessarily want to say that there's always a particular direction I'm going in, but it's important to me that every project that I do questions the nature of whatever program it is, right? So if I design a house, then it needs to question conventions of domestic architecture. Um, and the uh, way of thinking about space as volumes within volumes, I saw that as a way of questioning conventions, right? I mean, most of the time we think about um, envelope and the space that is enclosed by a single envelope, right? A building has a single envelope, it encloses a space. We shape that envelope and frame the spaces. But if you start to think about a building as being not just a single envelope, but multiple envelopes, then what's inside and outside anymore? I think that in the sleeve house, to some extent, I see the space in between the inside and outside. I mean, it's literally inside, but conceptually, I see it as sort of being outside. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not this like completely interior space, but it sort of lives in between being inside and outside. And so I was happy with that just because of this idea that okay, well, it's questioning the conventions of domestic architecture. And then so if you have this space, it's conceptually neither inside or outside, then what do you like, how do you think about that in terms of it being a domestic space? And I think that's where the story I was telling myself about the clients or the buyers as being art collectors was productive, because then I could think, well, it's not really the inside of a house, it's the inside of an art gallery. And so that gave me some kind of flexibility in the way I thought about that. Um, and then you mentioned the other house that I designed, which was the void within the envelope. And that was a play on the sleeve house, essentially. It's like, okay, well, if it's working to think about the envelope as being multiple envelopes, then what if we change the inner volume from something that houses program to something that's a void and like it completely empty? And so in that house, the inner volume still is a way of framing the space inside of it, and you end up with this kind of in between that the house is all the spaces in the house are caught in the in between the outer envelope and the inner void, and that gives them well, it gives you some resistance to the way you would typically design a house, right? Because you have this almost like this invader in the domestic realm. It's like, well, how do you deal with that? And right, how do you design around it? And what kind of other domestic experiences does that give you? And so then you end up with this almost absurd condition um, of the of the guts of the house being hollow, right? Which is also weird. I mean, and it's so I was happy with it just because of its absurdity, right? Usually we like enclose a building and we want all of that to be interior space, but what if you hollow it out? And it was almost like an oblique courtyard, and which is again like taking the idea of the courtyard where you hollow out the inside, but then you make it inaccessible. So it's not about, certainly not about pragmatics. I mean, this house was never built and it probably never will be built. But it's more um, a couple of like critiques or investigations of like how we tend to want to enclose domestic space. And so I think yeah, it's just those are the driving factors in projects like that is um, how do we move into something that's a little bit unusual, that destabilizes our notion of what a house should be or what a domestic experience should be.
You seem to be equally a teacher and a practitioner. I wonder, how does teaching affect your practice and vice versa?
Well, they really feed into each other in as an academic, as a professor who teaches design studios. Every semester, you start with a blank slate and you create a problem for the students to engage in, and they work on it for 14 weeks, and then it's done. Um, and so you can run through a lot of experiments that way and test different ways of thinking about space. I mentioned these sort of spatial explorations that came out of teaching and informed the Sleeve House. Um, at the moment, my design studios are really focused on the relationship between space and structure. And I think that was reflected in the design for the winery. The winery is less complex as a spatial proposition, but it was really focused on the relationship between the mass timber structure and the space inside of it. And so I'm still interested in this idea of, well, not accepting the convention and creating spaces that are dynamic and to some extent destabilizing, but to try to do it more with structure as opposed to just abstract form. I think the Sleeve House is pretty abstract, right? It's not the way that I worked with the engineer was like, okay, well, this is what I want it to be, and like the engineer was like, okay, well, this is what we need to do that. And as a first building project, that's fine, maybe, but as I've done more projects, like I want to be integrating structure more and thinking about structure more from the outset and seeing how structure can be synthesized with some of the ideas about space that I'm interested in. So right now in my design studios, particularly in the studios I teach about multi-unit housing, the the students start with a structural system. And, in housing, normally you try to make the structure as regular as possible. In my studios, I'm asking the students to tilt the structure and to some extent, there's only, it has to be within constraints, right? And that's another sort of balancing act, I think, or at least that I have only really been able to kind of uh, do, as I've gotten older, right? It's really tough to like, keep all these balls in the air. And when you're designing anything, even when you're creating a pedagogy for a design studio. But but the latest projects in my design studios have had mass timber structure in these housing buildings where the structure is leaning and is not always the same grid at every level. And that's really satisfying because and if somebody ever asked me to design a multi-unit housing building, I would be incredibly excited to like put this to the test, or maybe some other project will arise that allows me to put that to the test. But for me, it's really satisfying to. I mean, I see a lineage from the sleeve house. Well, like teaching, created some ideas that were in the sleeve house, and then that project and the winery um, taught me something that I have been able to bring back into my teaching as an academic. And now I'd like to find an avenue to bring, after I've worked on it in my design studios, I'd love to be able to find an avenue to bring that back into another building project.
I want to read a few of your quotes and hear how you could elaborate them.
Okay.
So, the first one is there are so many other things a house could be.
Mm. Well, I think that we the picture that we have of what domestic architecture should be is completely arbitrary, right? There's no reason like why a house should look like it does. Well, I mean, let me back up a little bit. Like, there's not no reason. If you look at the gable form of most houses, that makes sense, right? You want your roof to drain. Um, but a lot of like the materiality and the kind of arrangement of elements within a domestic architecture uh, isn't like, it has nothing to do with the way that we experience space. There's a lot of applique. There's a lot of arrangement of spaces that has to do a lot more, I would say, with conventions of what the building industry wants to sell, and that is no more or less valid than any other way of thinking about how to create space. I don't know. I mean, one thing that I often think about is Robin Evans's essay where he talks about the difference between Palladian planning, enfilade planning, and typical domestic architecture now, which is like rooms on a corridor. And if there's no corridor in your house, like in a Palladian villa, then you go through all of these rooms that are being inhabited, and you don't have the sense of privacy. And it's not like I'm necessarily think, oh, well, we should, design more Palladian villas, like, or, what we should design is like around less privacy. Um, but it's just that those two things are so, in a way, they're so diametrically opposed to each other in terms of like the expectations of privacy in the domestic realm, that I am interested in like, what else could things be, I mean, I think we just like accept the status quo way too easily. And, like I said earlier, it's like I'm not so ideological that I want to say, well, this is what we should do, right? This is what we're doing now, and this is what we should do. I'm a lot more interested in the experiment and um, letting the way that we can think as architects open up new avenues. And, it's okay for me if we don't, or if I don't know exactly where I'm going, but all I know is I want to go somewhere else.
Similarly, you said, I'm not interested in reinforcing a myth of architecture. And you also said you go into creative field because you want to open up questions.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, we're told stories about architecture from, the moment we enter architectural school. And I think that's like, we need those stories to ground ourselves and understand where we're coming from as architects and thinkers. And I think the real value of being exposed to those stories is to see that there are different stories. And so, you place yourself in the shoes of, I don't know, if we're talking about Palladio, that's like he's working, at the invention of representation and finding kind of a totally different way of envisioning buildings. You could put yourself in the shoes of Le Corbusier and his, kind of, and at least in some buildings, some pretty prescribed ways of thinking about like what architecture should be. But then, like a new generation comes on and, changes everything about that. And so I think that, as you study history, for me, it's more that, okay, well, the story changes and, how are we going to participate in that, the evolution of that story? I think that's what's most important to me.
You also said that resistance is important. So why would you say
Mhm.
so?
Oh, well, because, we are, um, if we're not consciously resisting something, then the only alternative is that you've accepted the status quo. I think if like if you're not, yeah, there's no way to um, push the boundaries of what architecture or any creative practice could be unless you're resisting something, because otherwise you're just like regurgitating what's already been done. And I think it's important that, or at least the way that I work. I mean, I don't know, maybe some people are more intuitive, but like there has to be some level of like, okay, I'm not like I'm resisting a convention here, or I want to make a house, but I don't want it to look like a house, or I want to enclose a building, but I don't want to do it with one envelope. Those are all like modes of resistance for me. I mean, it doesn't sound like much a lot of the times, but there's, I think, part of the way that you can find potentials for resistance in architecture is to find the moments where it's possible to create something within all the constraints that you're given. And that's the real challenge of architecture, I think, as opposed to other creative practices that are less constrained. Um, and it's part of the challenge and part of the pleasure. It's one of the that Shumi's advertisements for architecture are, the one about constraints is where he says like the greater the constraints, the greater the pleasure in the project, and that's something that I think about a lot.
What do you think about the current moment? There seems to be no resistance at all because the current situation is so driven by ideology
Hmm.
that everyone seems to be accepting what should be the process, and
Hmm.
everyone seems to be on board, and a lot of critics and professors and curators, they seem to be in a situation that kind of all of a sudden we have a clear vision of what kind of architecture should be, how to achieve it. And a lot of architects are just following that. So, for
Hmm.
example, this idea that you never start from scratch, right? So you always have to find something and add to it, especially if
Hmm.
we're talking about urban situation. And you never touch concrete. You should do it with timber.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
nature. You always have to integrate nature. You
Hmm.
should never do it as a single author or artist, right? It should
Hmm.
not be an art project at all. It should be very pragmatic, and it should be done very collectively. And
Hmm.
so there are a number of those points that everybody is following, everybody is happy about it, and you have to use ecological materials. So, do you think there is space for resistance in a situation like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always space for resistance. I think that, um, well, I mean, you brought up a number of things. One is the question of authorship. And I think architecture is always, it's always a collaborative endeavor. I mean, you can't build a building by yourself. But I mean, for me, authorship is still important. Um, I think that, as individuals, we want to express ourselves and we want to experience the expression of other individuals. And so while it is always a collaborative endeavor, I think that having a vision for what you want a project to be is important. And it's not that that vision can't come out of discussions or collaborations that you have with other people, but there's there's a I mean there's a kind of focus that gets lost if things are designed by committee, and it's important that we keep a level of focus and sharpness. An architectural project is not in any creative endeavor. It can't be everything to everybody. Some people are going to like it. Some people are going to hate it. Right. That's like the goal is not to make something that everybody is so watered down that everybody's okay with it. Like that's not interesting. I mean, that's most of what we are exposed to in our daily lives in the built environment, the media that we consume. Um, it's sort of watered down. It's palatable, but it's not sharp and it's not interesting. And I think that the sharpness and the kind of reaction that you can create is really important. Um, yeah, I mean, if everybody likes your project, then like you didn't really you didn't really try anything new.
I wonder why you said I am attracted to houses that are self-consciously undomestic.
Um, I guess I just can't stand the acceptance of convention. I don't, and I think that it's why you why I want to be in a creative field, right? Because you don't like there's something that like inherently you can't accept like what you've been given. Like you have to produce something else that has a different point of view or goes in a different direction. So I don't know. It's not like I go into go visit somebody in suburbia and like enter into like their McMansion. It's not like I'm revolted by that. Like I don't, I don't like I'd be sort of in a way attracted to it as an experience. Um, but as when it's time for me to produce something, it would be anathema to do that because that's what's already accepted and out there. And like I have absolutely no interest in um, reproducing something that's already been done before. I just think that for me, it's always an interest in a progression and what could be next.
And then finally, you said architecture is not so much about the use as the perception.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, if all we're concerned about is the use, then what would we end up with? Functional spaces, well, spaces that are only designed around function would be really bland, and if you're just designing for efficiency, that's uninteresting. Um, I mean, if you look at modern movement in architecture, there's, I mean, it's a very complex situation, but on the one hand, maybe there is like too much of a repetition of like a spatial order. There's a kind of monotony in that. But on the other hand, it's clearly not just about function. It's also about an aesthetic. as well. And any kind of modern architect that ever said it was just about function is like, I mean, in my opinion, is just diluted. I don't know because there's still an aesthetic there, but yeah, I mean, you see this a lot in students too, and so teaching really kind of reinforces this in my mind is that a student always wants to design little boxes with 8 foot tall ceilings, right? And I say, okay, well that's all the space you need, right? Um, but I think we talked about this earlier. It's like, well, what about cathedrals? Like you occupy this thin strip at the bottom, but the space is much bigger than that, and that's the experience. So I think that, and when it comes to houses too, I think and partly maybe it's because usually the client is limited on budget, um, that it's easy to get like pulled into this like kind of functionalist narrative for architecture and not find a way of letting the perceptual in.
If you could tell me what kind of architecture you are most drawn to, and what are key references, such as architects, projects, ideas that really informed your thinking?
Hmm. Well, I mentioned Shumi earlier, but I went to Columbia when he was the dean there and worked in his office for about 4 years after that. And so he's certainly kind of a guiding light for me. And one of I suppose there are maybe two projects that I'd want to talk about in terms of how they inform my thinking. One would be the Manhattan transcripts, where he invented a way of drawing in order to produce a new kind of space. And to me, I don't know, that is like the ultimate architectural move because I'm interested in representation and the relationship between representation and what we build, and this notion that you could invent a way of drawing that was based not on static forms, but on movement and the relationship between movement and space and actors in the space, and then produce an architecture that's based on that, is, I mean, amazing. And I don't know, you could go to Parc de la Valette and see, kind of the lineage of that development in the Manhattan transcripts. And you can, I don't know. I mean, when I go to Parc de la Valette, I can see it. And I don't know, maybe it's just because I am aware of where it came from, but that space feels about movement and you're drawn to these follies within the landscape. And a lot of the architecture has like this kind of, well, I don't want, yeah, I mean, like a kind of like movement built into it. Um, I always think about the waviness of the canopies, right? It's not just straight, but it's wavy, and this sort of like rhythm of the waviness and how you feel as you move along those, I think is really amazing. And then my other favorite project of Shumi's is Le Frenois, and because it's about the in between. And I mean, that's something that I've always been interested in. And so the space in between the new roof and the old roofs is like, that is for me like one of the best spaces in architecture, because of the fact that it's um, produced from two things to produce this third thing. I think in the sleeve house, I mean, it's not to compare that to Shumi's work, but to some extent, I was hoping that it could produce that third thing. I think the other thing, especially when it comes to the work that I do with houses, is Koolhaas's early villas are really incredible to me as houses that also just are, um, like I see those as they work as houses, but they're also completely undomestic. And the villa in Paris with the pool on the top, to me, that's like has always been a touchstone in terms of like how you use the language of domestic architecture, but twist it in a way so that it feels alien, it feels destabilizing. Um, and then the Bordeaux Villa is another project that I really love. It's built around the experience of a person in a wheelchair, but produces a completely different kind of domestic landscape because of um, that constraint or kind of the need for that experience of the person in the wheelchair to move in between the levels.
As far as naming a kind of mentor figure, would you say it's Chumi, or would you name someone else?
Shumi is definitely an influence. I don't know if you'd call him a mentor necessarily because, even though I worked in his office, is still, quite and not super close to him. Um, but I was going to mention Evan Douglas, who's the dean at RPI, and he hired me. He was actually my teacher at Columbia, um, and gave me my first teaching job at Pratt, and now he's the dean at RPI, and hired me there. And I would say he's really my mentor in the way that he approaches work. I mean, he's also somebody that is never satisfied with conventions and is always interested in pushing boundaries and seeing something new. And the kind of environment that he creates for me and for my colleagues to work at RPI really espouses that desire to experiment. And we certainly do have constraints in what we have to deliver in the context of a professional program. But Evan is like he wants us to see us pushing boundaries as individual critics. He wants to see your voice as an author, as a teacher, and and that your voice is in the work. I think he's really happy when he sees different studios in the same section, and they're different because the teacher has introduced a pedagogy that's their own, and he really, I think, values that diversity of voices.
When you speak about your work, you use such words and phrases as an object in a landscape, geometric clarity, framed relationships, distinctive objects, weathered skin, character, surface roughness and texture, layers, unconventional, an object within an object, nesting one thing inside another, the outer thing and the inner thing, in between spaces, and so on.
Mhm.
How else would you describe your work, and what kind of architecture do you try to achieve?
Um, I think I wouldn't wouldn't want to pin it down, and I guess I wouldn't want to necessarily even be able to describe what I want to achieve in a series of a couple sentences. I think I don't I'm just sort of even realizing this as you're asking the question, but I feel a little allergic to that. That say, okay, well, here's what I want to do, because I don't know. I think that part of what I'm most interested in is the uncertainty of the discovery. And so if you if you like put something conventional in front of me, like like, I want to do something else. Like, I think it's important to like just doing like inherently being unconventional has value. I would just say inherently. Like, I don't, and the thing that you do that resists convention, it could work or it could not work. Like, it could be a successful building or an unsuccessful building. Um, but I think that just the fact that you put up some level of resistance, like that has value. And so I think that every project that I come to, I'm looking for a way of doing that. And, it depends on the project, like what the resistance would be. And it sounds like I wouldn't say that like, it's an architecture of resistance because it sounds too um, militaristic or too radical. But, I think you need a sort of kind of soft touch of resistance in everything that you do as an architect. And I don't like honestly, like that can take you in down many different avenues. But I wouldn't say there's only like one thing um, that I'm aiming for. Like I don't. If I knew that, then I wouldn't be interested in the profession.
And finally, what brings you the greatest joy in working as an architect?
Um, I don't know. I think that there's definitely, when somebody says, "Oh, this, I really enjoy this building that you designed." I think every architect, gets a lot of satisfaction from that. But honestly, it's just the discovery, the process of discovery as you move through a project that I find to be the most engaging thing. And we work through this visual language we've inherited um, down from the Renaissance, right? And now we have all kinds of new representational tools that allow us to visualize things. But for me, architecture is really a lot about how we use those tools and how we create new. I don't know. It's too much to say we create new languages within those tools, but we make new discoveries. Um,
Thank you, Adam.
thank you.